what I have is called a Doctor of Musical Arts.
Okay.
So it covers a bunch of different things. So in my particular case, it covers trombone performance.
Okay.
But it can cover a bunch of different specializations, kind of in the subsector of music.
Right. I always thought it was interesting that when you go to a school of music, when you attend a school of music, you actually major in your whatever you play. Are there other majors outside of that? I've always wondered, because for the most part, it seems like people go and they pick, trombone or trumpet or something like that, and they kind of run with it.
Well, that's what we call performance. So for my doctorate, I have a degree in trombone performance. My master's and my bachelor's degree are officially in what we call jazz studies. So I have jazz studies as my degree, but my primary instrument is then indicated as trombone, right? So I took trombone lessons and spent time, studying the trombone as my vehicle to learning about jazz.
Right.
So,
go ahead.
So even if you're studying music ed, so say you're studying to be a music teacher, at the K through 12 level, you can do that, but you're going to have a primary instrument. So you're going to be forced to study some sort of instrument as your primary instrument. So if you were a percussionist, you come in, you study percussion. If you're vocals, you come in and you study vocals, but your focus is music education and not performance per se.
Right. So now, could you go ahead and just go straight for performance?
You could, yeah.
Okay.
You could. The school that I went to for undergrad did not have a jazz performance option. We did jazz studies. We were expected to learn about African and African American history. We were, expected to do all these other things. So we were looking at jazz more as a part of the national and global society at large versus just, a genre of music, right? So we looked at it from a more holistic point of view. And then when I went to get my master's degree, the school that I went to, they offered what they call like a jazz pedagogy program. So, we say broadly jazz studies, but specifically I was studying how to teach jazz, right?
Okay.
So performance was a part of that, but it wasn't the be all end all, right? But you can do that. Lots of people go and study, just performance, and they end up doing that. So.
Right. Now, one thing that I wanted to bring up, actually, before I bring that up, did you pick up, was the trombone always something you played, or was it something you picked up when you went to school?
I started as a drummer.
Okay.
My grandfather was a drummer, and then my mom didn't end up playing anything, right? So a lot of times musicians' kids don't want anything. They love music, and they're probably some of the biggest supporters of the arts, but they don't want any part of that lifestyle that they see their parents, dealing with. And so that was my mom, right? So she didn't want any part of music.
Sure.
She just bought a lot of music and took me to a lot of concerts, but she did not want that life. So I initially started out as a drummer. My older half brother was playing drums when we were kids, and so I just thought drums were the coolest thing ever. And I beat on stuff constantly around the house,
Sure.
right? And so I played drums through elementary school. And in elementary school, you meet your best friend, right? This person that you end up being connected with for the rest of your life.
Right.
And mine had a drum set, and I didn't. And so part of our friendship was I could come over to his house and play his drum set, right? So I would go over to his house and play his drum set. But his family also had a piano in the house, and his mom played the flute in college, and she would pick up the flute and play it sometimes. And one weekend I happened to be there spending the weekend with them, and his dad pulled out a trombone and started playing this trombone. And I'm like, what is this? And so my friend, he and his brother thought it was just this fun noisemaker. So they each took turns making noise on it and driving their mother crazy. And he handed it to me and told me what to do. And I played a note. And he was like, how could you play a note and they can't. And so he started, having me do certain things, and I was making a sound. And so I was like, that was fun. And I put it away and didn't think about it. Well, my best friend's dad called the school and told the band director, like, hey, I had Emmett Goods at my house, and I know he's a drummer for you, but you should hear him play trombone, because he could actually play trombone a little bit. He can make a sound. And so the band director was like, I heard you can play trombone a little bit. I was like, I can't play trombone. So he said, well, I want you to work with Mr. Stevens and get good and see what happens. And I started playing both. Yeah, I played both instruments through middle school, because playing two instruments, you got to miss more class.
Right.
So who wants to be in class, right? So I played both instruments through middle school, and then in high school, I was still playing drums and I was good, and I got to a point where I wasn't quite in the top echelon. Like, I could play, and people had confidence in my playing and appreciation for it, but I wasn't one of the first guys picked. And I looked up and I was like, they needed 4 drummers, but right, for these 2 bands that they were picking for kids for All-Stars, and they needed 8 trombone players, and only 7 showed up. I was like, oh, well, damn, if I would have just came with a trombone, I would have made the band.
Right.
So I was like, maybe I'm focusing in on the wrong instrument. And I talked about it with my teachers, and they're like, you're going to be a musician, and so you should really probably start focusing in on one. So in high school, I started to just focus on trombone and put the drums down.
Right. Well, that's great that you had some people to kind of say, hey, let's pick one. It seems like you're really into this. Let's pick one and get real good at it.
Yeah, I mean, we knew I needed a scholarship too, right? Like, my parents didn't have a whole lot of money.
Yep.
My father passed away when I was 15.
Mm-hmm.
So
scholarship would have made things easier.
Scholarship got you out the hood.
Right.
So you could either keep dodging bullets and in the hood and stay there, or you could get a scholarship and go to college and get away from all that, right?
Right. And that was a big driving factor for you.
Yeah, I mean, I knew I wanted a college education. My half siblings, my older sister and brother, are 13 and 9, almost 10 years older than me. So I watched them. They both got bachelor's degrees and seemed to be able to enter into society, right, with no problems. So I wanted that. I figured, if they went to college and are able to be adults and function and buy things and be okay, that's probably what I need to do too.
Right.
And in the neighborhood that I lived in, if you didn't go to college, it just seems like you had a much harder way to go, So I was just like, I got to figure out a way to do this.
Yeah, I spoke with another gentleman on here, and he talks about how there's either a pack of dogs behind you or there's a gold medal you're chasing, but you got to run one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about being a man of color in the mid 90s, the city I grew up in, Pittsburgh, was still kind of coming up from up under its crack epidemic and kind of the gang violence that was a major part of the city for that time, and while we were beginning to see the economic boom of America, right? Clinton's in office at that point, and you can basically get a job anywhere. Not enough to be a self-sufficient adult.
Sure.
Right? Like, you ain't getting no, $15, $20 an hour factory job where you can like comfortably go get a apartment and attempt to start life from that position.
Right.
You have to make some decisions,
Yeah, especially now with how, I think there's been a real rise in uptick regarding like entrepreneurial endeavors and stuff like that, because everybody sees how fragile things are and how, maybe a degree isn't the end all be all for everybody now. But
No,
yeah,
but the access to education is a lot different,
sure.
right? So not necessarily going to a university or a college doesn't mean that you aren't an educated individual. We walk around with the greatest library in the world in our pockets, right? Like these things right here, like these cell phones, right? Man, like you're talking 25, 30 years ago when I was, a young person, like that was a dream.
Sure.
Like I can remember physically having to go to the library to access the internet because I didn't have it at home. So the ability to do those types of things, start a business venture or anything like that, all the research that you need to do, you are able to do it, once again at your fingertips. So you don't necessarily need that same time in a classroom learning theory and things like that. But I will say, I do think for young people, especially young people of color, I still want more of them to go through this academic system.
Right.
Because what it does is it teaches you to think about things in a much more broader sense. It makes you figure out how to connect the dots and not just figure out what's pushing down and putting pressure on you.
Right.
When you are poor and you're black, and you're a male, look at the situation we're in right now. We're talking about Black Lives Matter. You feel like you're hunted. You feel like you're just pressed down upon. It helps you to go be in the system and understand how they created the system, why the system works the way that it does, maybe learn about other places in the world where the system is different, where our people are thriving and doing a lot better. Maybe learn about all the different ways that we are interconnected to all of these different places and things in the world. It gives you a better understanding and sense of self, of who you are, what your worth is. And so you're not just only believing what society tells you, right? You're not just believing what the mainstream tells you.
Right.
You're able to have all this theory and background, right?
Yeah, that's a great insight, one that I haven't heard before, but it's a great point. I had another professor from URI, you may be familiar with James Haley, Professor James Haley.
Hale, yes.
Hale, yes. I apologize. And we spoke a lot about this. We spoke a lot about how there are plenty of intellectuals from Africa and from these other parts in the world that were having very similar ideas as the white guys in Europe, but were just kind of blown off and, forgotten about.
If you think about it, right, we love these stories of all of these great civilizations and people fighting for control of power and all of this, right? We had 10 seasons of Game of Thrones. We have 7 seasons of Vikings on the History Channel. We love hearing these stories. Well, we had African civilizations, right? That did much the same. Do you know the story of Shaka Zulu and how he took a small, tiny herding tribe, right, that had nothing more than just a really cool name in the region? They weren't even the top dogs, and he ends up becoming a military stalwart that people still talk about when you study military history, right? Or when will we really get the true story of Hannibal and what Hannibal did, leaving Africa, going through and conquering much of the Mediterranean? When will we tell those stories? When will we tell the stories of the Moors from North Africa and from the Middle East that came and went and basically controlled much of Spain, Portugal for a very long time? Right. When will we start to be interested in telling those stories and understanding the significance of them in history, right? They had reigns of very long periods. When will we tell those stories? When will we tell the stories about all of these fantastic indigenous tribal organizations that were, the Cherokee Nation? Like, that's a real thing. Like, there were states, there was all these differences within the Cherokee Nation based off of where, where your family was actually from on the map at that particular point in time. When will we learn the map of the indigenous peoples of America and how they had kind of cut things up? When will we be able to recognize that as Americans? And, we have a lot of work to do, and it's only just begun.
Right. And it is very unfortunate that we're taught from an early age a lot of the wrong stuff, a lot of the, we could say, sugar-coated things.
Yes.
Like just the simple idea that, this is the one that everybody talks about, the simple idea that Christopher Columbus was this great person who did all these phenomenal things. And that's what we grew up as kids. We love it. Oh, Christopher Columbus. We get to have a thing in class. We get to make boats, whatever. But as you get older, you're like, wow, this guy was a real, a-hole. Like, he didn't do anything great, so to speak, right? He didn't discover anything. But it's very, and that's just one instance. That's the instance that we all talk about super, super often. And I think the fact that we have access to so much more information has been a blessing as well as a curse, but it's great that we get to see these other sides. It's just unfortunate that it's not so much in the popular view as some of these other things.
And which is one of the reasons why I love teaching, right? Because, while I am a trombone player and officially, like, I'm supposed to be here teaching jazz trombone and teaching all these jazz courses, right? I direct the University of Rhode Island Big Band, which I absolutely adore doing. I love those students with my whole heart. I love teaching jazz trombone. I'll have 3 jazz trombone students next year. All 3 of them are fantastic. 2 of them are graduate students, which is another big honor because at the graduate level, people have to really respect you in order to, want to come and do that type of work with you, right? But what I really love to do is teach these general education classes. I love teaching history of jazz because it's almost like I'm telling my family history. Right. I told you my mother's father was a musician. He was, and he played with all these important jazz luminaries in the 50s and 60s and even the early 70s before he passed. He was this major heavyweight. But I kind of see my family as not just going back as far as my granddad, right? I see him as one of the many steps in the lineage of this music. And if I get up there in the history of jazz, when I'm telling you about Louis Armstrong and I'm telling you about his life and his music and the things that he had to go through, I'm telling you the history of African American people. I'm telling you the struggle that we've had to deal with in living in this country, about how we are not a racist people. Musicians like Louis Armstrong have wanted diversity and inclusion since they started in the teens and 20s, because they always knew that white and black musicians always secretly got together and played music together and drank together. And in Louis Armstrong's case, smoked marijuana together, right? Like they did all of those things. And he knew that there was no differences between the people. But you see that it took almost his entire career for civil rights to happen and for that to really be and understood and not just this taboo thing that we don't talk about, right? So I can tell the history. I can tell the history of gender. We can talk about the role women have played in the development of jazz and how that correlates to America. I love telling those stories. I love telling the story of hip hop because it's like I'm telling my life story, right? I'm telling my students about my 42 years here on this earth as I tell them about the history of hip hop. Now, we started in the 1960s, but that's important because that's right when my parents were young adults, teenagers and young adults, right? So I get to take them back to what was foundational, what was changing in my parents' world, and how that music and those ideologies kind of grew and developed into this music that just becomes the soundtrack of my life.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? It becomes the soundtrack of my life. It becomes this thing that is on the radio and plays in the background, and we rush home to watch the videos after school or to see, Rap City or whatever it is. But it's also foundational to what's going on in my world. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Sure.
it becomes a soundtrack, and I get to give them a look at all of these. I get to make them consider and think about all of this music in a way that's, a lot different than just music. It doesn't become music, it becomes life,
That to me has always been the reason why music has been, in my view, one of the more, I guess, spectacular of the arts, because you're essentially taking, when we're talking about music in and of itself, not so much lyricism, you're taking a language that only so many people know how to speak. Mm-hmm. And you're almost turning it into a cohesive piece, a cohesive writing, if you will, that evokes something from people, some kind of an emotion, some kind of a feeling. It brings you back to a time. It gets you excited for things like you were mentioning. You want to see the videos. You want to get the sneakers. You know what I'm saying? All that stuff. And to me, when I find a new song, for example, the other day, I was shuffling through Apple Music, and now it does this thing where it recommends music to you. And
that's a whole other conversation, but yeah.
Right. It sent me to B.B. King, and
okay.
It was for the first time I heard "The Thrill Is Gone." And I've heard of the song, but I never knew that it was like a phenomenal piece of music. And when I listened to it, I was like, wow. But
see, that's my grandfather. Yeah. That's my grandfather. That was, see, when that would come on, my brother and I, our ears would perk up, right? Yeah. And me especially, I was grandfather's baby. Like I always wanted to be up under my grandfather. But my grandmother, her and her good Baptist upbringing, like she didn't tolerate that. My grandfather was gonna start drinking and listening to the blues with his boys, and they was gonna start, listening to this unacceptable, these proper Baptist women like that. Children shouldn't be hearing that type of stuff. Man, we had to get out the classroom. But like you said, you hear this wonderful piece, and you're like, the thrill is gone. Like, man, that says so much about life, about being a black man in the the 50s when B.B. King is recording that. It just says so much about everything in just a few words.
Right.
It's just amazing. And then the pain of his solo when he gets into the solo after he sings that chorus, and he goes into that guitar solo and the way he bent them strings, man, it was the most, you could almost cry thinking about what he was going through.
Yes.
That's what makes music great. That's what makes music great.
I think that's part of the reason why music like blues and hip hop became so big, because of the fact that it's those two are some examples of music that you're getting something from the person's environment. Mm-hmm. You're understanding why this person is the way that they are, why they made this music. And I feel, hip hop is probably the biggest example of that. Mm-hmm. And go ahead.
No, I'm listening to you.
Yeah. No, I was just, it's to me, anytime you can get the emotion out of somebody through a song, through a piece, that's when it's something legit. It's something different than just a song that's on the radio.
You're absolutely right. But I will say this. Hip hop, as with all these other black art forms of music that we've been talking about, jazz, blues. I'm so happy you're talking about blues, especially blues of that era. You know, it just, America owes so much to that music, right? But when you talk about hip hop, being black in America means that every time you create something, it means from the moment you create something, it no longer belongs to you.
Right.
That's what being black in America means, right? Because all of these art forms that you're talking about have all been co-opted, right? Which is not necessarily a terrible thing, right? When we talk about cultural appropriation and all these other things, you have people that do it with honor and respect, right? And with love and appreciation. You're talking about hip hop. Think about somebody like Eminem. Right? His lyricism can't be questioned, right? Like, you know, what he did with this music, you know, you have to tip your cap. You know, that's not cultural appropriation, that's expression, right?
Sure.
But all of these things have been taken from us. But one of the reasons why it's important, especially in this academic sense, to study all of these musics as you're understanding America, as you're understanding the cultural development of America, the development of American society, is all of these black musics at one point or another were the voice for voiceless people. Okay?
Right.
They were the voice for voiceless people. When we think about hip hop at its inception in the 1970s, when it gets started, hip hop was a voice for teenage and early 20-something-year-old black men that were just old enough to literally have vivid memories of Dr. King before and after his assassination. So they grew up with the expectancy of things changing. Then they were just old enough to have seen the promised time come. They were there in 1964 and 1965, but then they were just old enough to be able to feel and sense the disappointment of their elders as the time came, and very little changed for them.
And that birthed hip hop.
So at birth hip hop, this was a young people that were pissed off. Brown versus Board of Education, was it 1954, 1955? The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, those two things a decade later, right? So all of these things were supposed to change and shift the world to make America a level playing field and really give black people, really all people of color in this country, because, we love to show the signs that say no blacks allowed, whites only, and all this other stuff. But when you go out into the western part of the United States, it would say no Mexicans or no Spanish. And I show my students those signs. Like, when we say civil rights, please don't think binary. Don't think black and white. You can't leave these brown folks out, because they was dealing with some stuff too. They were that area's brown people. You dig what I'm saying? It's like they were dealing with some things too.
Right.
So you're talking about a people who were expecting all of this stuff to quote unquote get better, and none of it did. And then you're talking about New York City. Not only did none of this stuff get better, but they had already been playing around with gentrification and eminent domain in New York, and they decided to throw up this Cross Bronx Expressway right? So that the people could get out to the suburbs a lot easier. So who did they move? The black and the brown people.
Right.
All the Puerto Rican families and Dominican families and Cuban families who had, immigrated to this country trying to make a better way for themselves. All y'all go head on over there, Co-op City. You dig what I'm saying? Head on out there to the Bronx. No, get to Yankee Stadium. No, keep going. Few blocks higher. Keep going. Keep on going. You know what I'm saying? Y'all too close. If you at the stadium, you too close. You know what I'm saying? So keep pushing. All the and then the ones that were in Manhattan. We're going to take Manhattan back over.
Yeah.
Right? Spanish Harlem was a thing. Spanish Harlem is nowhere near what it probably was at one point in time. Mm. Right? Where you had Black Harlem, Spanish Harlem. That was a thing. No, we're taking all of those places back. Now go head on over there.
Right. There is something to be said. And I don't think I came up with this. I might have heard this somewhere else. But I like my artists, and of all different facets. I like them to be very emotionally troubled. I love when an artist had I don't love it, but it makes for edgier art, I should say, edgier, more palatable in my mind. When somebody comes from a painful background, comes from a rough life. The one of my favorite art forms in general is comedy. You see a guy like Richard Pryor, who grew up in a whorehouse, had all these demons, smoked crack, and did all these terrible things, but was an absolute genius when he got on the mic. Mm-hmm. So to me, it doesn't it doesn't fix everything. Obviously, it doesn't fix anything at all. But without some of that pain, without some of that hardship, we might not have some of this music.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. All you need is pain.
Right.
The pain doesn't necessarily have to be from
a systematic thing.
Systematic trauma, right?
Right.
It could be stuff that you put on yourself.
Right.
Right? And genius is genius. So let me give you two examples from jazz, right? In the world of jazz, you've got Miles Davis.
Right.
And when people, what you're describing, like you described Richard Pryor's upbringing, Miles Davis's upbringing was the exact opposite. His father was a dentist. They were a well-to-do black family. That's a thing. There have been, for a long time now, African Americans who've been able to figure it out in this system. Not many, not nearly enough to say that things were going okay, but there have always been some. And Miles Davis came from one of those families where his mother never worked. The father did very well. They owned, not only did they have a house in the city, they had country property and they owned horses. And, they like when you hear about Miles Davis's upbringing, you're like,
really?
What world? Yeah, you're like, this is St. Louis? Like, really? This is East St. Louis? Like what planet is this? Like, Missouri is hard on black folks, like hard. Like Missouri is not a place that you think of black folks thriving. But I mean, Miles Davis had all of that. But his own life, he inflicted so much trauma and pain on himself, rebelling against what his family wanted him to do, which was to, not take the more exploratory road in music, but to take the more conventional road, starting a family at a very young age, following behind Charlie Parker, which meant that, he ended up dabbling in drug abuse, and having to clean up from all of those different things ended up causing, enough stuff in his life that, like you said, there was plenty of pain in his music. But then you look at somebody like Duke Ellington, who, much like Miles Davis, but just happened to be doing it in Washington, D.C. instead of East St. Louis. He lived that same life. where his father, made a lot of money. The mother never worked. They had the finest things. They were fair complected African Americans, which also gave them a level of elitism, because we don't talk about that in the African and Afro-Caribbean communities. Colorism is real, and it matters what color brown
right.
you are, right? Like, even within the family, right? There's the lighter skinned auntie that, with the good hair, and she's the pretty auntie. And then there's the darker skinned auntie who, everybody talks about her like a dog and she can't do no right,
Right.
Like, it's just a thing. But, Duke Ellington was very fair complected and, came from a lot of money. But the music he wrote was brilliant. And when he did get political in his music, it was always very poignant. So it wasn't uninformed. So, yes, you're right. The common trend is that people who have these terrible backgrounds, Eminem we talked about earlier, right? They end up writing this phenomenal music. But man, genius is genius, right? Like,
that's a good point.
You know what I'm saying? People who have it, it doesn't matter what their background is.
Right.
You give them an artistic medium and they're going to be able to show you something that you would have never seen on your own or heard on your own, Now,
it's funny that you brought up Miles Davis. I'm sure we would have gotten into it at some point. But he was one of my introductions. I watched.
Yeah.
It is for a lot of people. There's people who will say, I don't like jazz, but I like Miles Davis.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and what was interesting about him was that in the daytime, he would go to class. He went to Juilliard, correct?
Yep.
He would go to class. He would, do his thing. He wanted to learn like, the greats did, Mozart and Bach and all these things. He kind of wanted to emulate them, more or less, in terms of, knowledge. And then at night, he would go play with Bird and Diz, and, they'd keep him on the horn for hours and hours. And that's how he was able to kind of develop his style.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was just a real interesting. And it made me a huge fan of him. Now my phone, I have, all of it on there. Kind of Blue, Bitches Brew, all of it, on the corner, all that stuff. I find it all interesting.
Now, on the corner, you're into hip hop, right? So on the corner, the percussionist on the corner is a guy by the name of Mtume.
Okay.
Or sometimes they list him as James Mtume, whose father also played with Miles Davis. His father, Jimmy Heath, was a tenor saxophonist and also played with Miles Davis. I say that because Mtume is also probably one of the more important producers of R&B music from the mid 1970s until about the mid 1980s. And then he was the music supervisor for a really important show that featured a lot of hip hop called New York Undercover.
Okay.
Right, which was a detective show, but it featured a young black and a young Puerto Rican actor. And, they told stories about, black and Puerto Rican people in New York, committing crimes and, the whole crack epidemic of that era and everything else. But Mtume wrote the famous song Juicy Fruit, which is where I love it when they call me Big Papa, which the name of that is
Big Papa.
No, it's called Juicy.
Oh, Juicy.
Yeah, Biggie calls it Juicy.
Right.
But that's where that sample comes from.
Oh,
is
okay.
James Mtume, who played with Miles Davis.
Wow.
He played in Miles Davis's band.
Right. And that On the Corner was incredibly different. It was everything he made was incredibly different.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is Miles Davis ends up putting his hands on musicians from like the 1950s on. Miles Davis was dealing with musicians that were going to be changing the next era in music. So if you think about it, in the 1950s, he's playing with John Coltrane. Right. And John Coltrane ends up completely coming and changing jazz in the 1960s. He's also playing with Cannonball Adderley, who in the 1960s changes jazz in a completely different way. He opens us up to kind of soul jazz, which has ended up kind of being the gateway drug to what we would now call smooth jazz, right? Miles Davis was always like that, always playing with people who were going to change music in another way. In the 1960s, he's playing with Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock, and they're going to come along in the 1970s and change jazz in another way, right? 1970s, he's playing with Mtume, and then, Mtume is going to come along and change music in another way, change hip hop and then change R&B and then subsequently change hip hop, and then in the 1980s, he's playing with this bass player by the name of Marcus Miller, and Marcus Miller is going to come along and change music in another way, like through production and all this other stuff. He's going to produce people like Luther Vandross and do all this other stuff where all this music is forward and it's the most current thing. But you touch and you look back and you're like, oh, there's Miles Davis in the corner. Like all of this music is literally only 1 or 2 steps away from Miles Davis, which is utterly amazing.
Right. Yeah. After watching that, I was like, I didn't have nearly the idea. I always heard about Miles Davis, but I never had nearly the idea of the impact that he had on not just jazz music, but music as a whole. Like,
yeah,
just the way that he played. It was funny because a lot of people say, I want to feel how Miles Davis plays.
Yeah.
It was, and correct me if I'm wrong later on, just to add to that list we're making, didn't he work with Cool G Rap at one point? Real later on?
Yeah, because he makes he makes some of the earliest like hip hop and jazz fusion records, sure. Right? So before we get Us Three out of the UK and some of the other stuff that we had going on in the US, Miles his last album was Doo-Wop, which was this record that mixed jazz with hip hop. So he was always forward thinking like that.
Right. Those are the best artists, the ones that are always willing to learn, even from anybody. Anybody.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to bring up to you, as we're getting closer to kind of wrapping this thing up, are you familiar with I think he's a comedian, Eric Andre? He has his show.
Yeah.
Crazy whacked out show. But he actually is a I forget what college he graduated from, but he graduated a major in stand-up bass.
Okay.
He decided to switch over to comedy because he realized at some point that being really, really good at playing music doesn't really matter in the music industry if you want to get somewhere. Is that something that you can maybe attest to or maybe see where he's coming from?
It's interesting because what I've seen in music over the last 25 years now, right? So from the time I graduated college up until now, it's been 25 years. What I've seen in the music industry is specifically the jazz industry. When I started college, they were literally handing out recording contracts to most of the top, graduating jazz seniors. If you were at Berklee School of Music or Manhattan School of Music or the New School and you could really play, and some of the elders, were saying your name, you got a recording contract, and off you went. By the time I graduated in 2000, early 2000s, that was shut off. And people who were way better than me, not even they could get a taste of, being able to be in the jazz industry and really begin to establish themselves. Now, I say that to say this. Not only were young people cut off from recording, but there wasn't a whole lot of places that they could apprentice. Up until the 1990s, there was always places that a young jazz musician could apprentice. Horace Silver might hire you for his band, or Art Blakey might hire you for his band. The Count Basie Orchestra might have a chair open up and you could tour with them for a while. Or Illinois Jacket might have a seat in his band, or Lionel Hampton might have a seat in his band. And you kind of worked in those places, probably didn't make a whole lot of money, but you got time on the road. People started to say your name and you could figure things out. But when I graduated, all of that shut down. Right? I got calls to join the Illinois Jacket Band, but I could never get in there at the time when he needed me. And then he passed away. That's gone. Never comes back.
Right.
Horace Silver became so old he couldn't tour anymore. My mentor, Jackie McLean, kind of stopped touring and really, doing much after the early part of 2000. There was just no place to go. And so I think that's what Eric Andre was talking about, is the fact that, as a college student playing jazz, even playing bass, he was working probably and meeting some musicians who were otherworldly talents that he knew if he was looking honestly in his heart, he knew most of those people the world would never hear.
Right.
Or if they did hear them, they wouldn't care. Because right now we're in this time where everybody can kind of self-promote and self-produce, but that just means that you're tossing your stuff in there amongst a crowd of other things. So now how do you gain attention in this kind of cacophony of noise? Like, there's all this stuff here. How do you really stand out? And I think that's what he's talking about. It's interesting that you say that he plays bass, because that means that his decision was even harder, because that's a working instrument. He could have finished his degree. Everybody needs a bass player, and everybody needs a good bass player. So if you're a good bass player, you constantly work. My brother has never had a real job. My older brother plays bass, right?
That's the dream.
And sometimes it makes me mad, but he has been touring the world since 1991.
Wow.
He literally graduated from Berklee College of Music and went on his first tour a few weeks after that and has never looked back. He's never had to teach college. He's never had to teach, middle school.
Right.
He's never had to, all the things that I've done as part of the struggle. He's never had to play any cruise ship tours, any of the more menial forms of making a living in music. He's never had to do, because he was a good bass player and he was able to make it happen. But, I think that's what Eric Andre is talking about. Like, you can be really good, and then that's your life. Like, who really gets to hear your music? Who really gets to
right.
do?
There's no real machine behind real artistry in the sense of technical music. Right. Yeah. So that leads me to my next question: is where is jazz music as a form of entertainment? Because obviously the height of it was ages ago, and we can appreciate it for that. But when I try to think now, I couldn't even tell you a jazz artist that plays today. And that's partly because I'm, not in the space, not nearly as much as you are. But I guess, that's my question. What is the current state of jazz music?
Jazz is alive and well. And I think the pandemic is really going to be a launching pad for what jazz is going to be in this 21st century. Right? Because we've spent this first 20 years of this 21st century really still shaking off all the paradigms of the 20th century. Right? And we're losing people in their 80s and 90s now. And they're kind of really the last folks to have lived through the better part of jazz's golden era, shall we say. Now we're into a place where, the people who are really a big part of this music have really seen jazz doing like this, right? Be in its decline. And I think jazz is in a place now where we are figuring out who and what we will be in this 21st century, right? And we are navigating using all of these technologies, whether it be doing online concerts, whether it be doing collaborations with people from all different types of places. And I think we're also just seeing some renewed interest.
Right.
Disney's hit movie so far for this 2020, 2021 year is the Jamie Foxx movie Soul, which is about a jazz musician, somebody who wants to do nothing more than to create and be heard. So I think people are going to be open to what jazz is and what it can do as a creative space and a venue. You see John Batiste, who was heavily involved in that film Soul. People see him every night on The Late Show. The Roots, while they are definitely 100% hip hop, but those guys are from Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is a major jazz and black music city when you talk about Philadelphia International, or Philadelphia being the home of the Heath Brothers and Benny Golson and Lee Morgan and John Coltrane. They're also heavily steeped in jazz. There's some folks out there in the popular space who still connect to this improvised music, this black music that is about growth and expression.
Right.
And I think we're going to see it start to slide back into a more widely recognized space. I don't know that it will be a heavily commercial space, though. I can't say that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. It probably works to the point that we were just talking about how there's no real machine, no real PR machine behind it, I would think.
Yeah, and it's also, too, monetization of all art is getting tricky.
Right.
Because there are so many platforms and spaces for people to try to entertain. That means that really filtering that down so that everybody can make a living becomes.
I've always wanted to go to the Jazz Festival in Newport. Have you been?
I have been. I mean, to be quite honest with you, man, it is a very powerful experience when you think about this is the festival where, Duke Ellington played and Louis Armstrong played and Ella Fitzgerald played and John Coltrane played. And man, and you're just in that space and you understand that like for, 60 years, this has been happening. And, or, close to 70 years, this has been happening and people have been doing it. And you also understand that it is not just a Rhode Island thing or a New England thing, but it is Rhode Island's connection to the world.
Yes.
Right? Like when you leave this little place that we're in, and I know we don't like to do that, right? We also don't like to travel more than 20 minutes here in Rhode Island. I totally get that. But when you leave and you say, oh, I'm from Rhode Island, people say, oh, I've been to the Newport Jazz Festival, or I've always wanted to go.
Yes. Yep.
Right? Or I was talking about cruise ship. I was on my cruise ship gig, and cruise ship, you play with musicians from all over the world. So some of the British musicians were like, oh, yeah, you know what? I remember when this ship used to be part of the Newport Jazz Festival, and we loved going to Rhode Island. Right? Like that's their fondest memory. Like when you say you're from America, they're thinking about the Newport Jazz Festival.
Right. Yeah.
And like what that meant and the fact that they got to be a part of that. Like like, there's something to hold your head up and say, man, Rhode Island it plays an important and very significant piece in the history of jazz.
Yeah, huge. I remember when I watched that documentary, and the gentleman who runs, I don't know if he still does, but at the time was running the Newport Jazz Festival, and they're talking
George Wein.
Yes, yeah. And he talks about how Miles Davis went up there and did his thing. And I want to say it was after he was away for a little while.
Yeah.
And he came back, and that's where he like made his appearance back. And that's just crazy to think that in 1950 something,
55. I want to say 55. Miles comes and plays the Newport Jazz Festival.
Right.
So here's the thing. Miles Davis starts playing with Charlie Parker, and I know we're almost at time. I'm sorry, brother.
No.
But so Miles Davis starts playing with Charlie Parker in the 1940s, right? First, as they were both members of the Billy Eckstine band, and then later, he ends up playing in Charlie Parker's quintet as Charlie Parker is kind of establishing himself apart from Dizzy Gillespie, right? So both he and Dizzy Gillespie are doing their own separate things. And Miles Davis ends up being one of the first trumpet players to kind of replace Dizzy Gillespie in the group. So as a part of that, he and Charlie Parker end up getting closer. Miles Davis ends up starting his own journey into the world of heroin, right? And so he gets addicted to heroin. 1953, I think about 4 years or so after he kind of starts dabbling or whatever, he decides, look, I can't do this. My marriage is in a gazillion pieces, my wife and my kids, and my life is just a mess. I got to do better. I ain't keeping stuff together. Miles Davis goes home to East St. Louis, right? I think his father like comes to get him or something like that and takes him to East St. Louis to the farm. And Miles like rode horses and just kind of kicked heroin cold turkey.
Right.
But the interesting thing is when he does that, this little unknown trumpet player from Delaware, right, by the name of Clifford Brown, comes up to New York and lights New York on fire, right? He had been an urban legend probably for about a year and a half. So since about 1951, 1952, people have been talking about, man, there's this dude down in Philadelphia and Delaware named Clifford Brown. Like, my God, I ain't never heard nobody play no trumpet like that. And everybody's like, yeah, he's in Delaware. He's in Philly. Ain't nobody worried about him.
Right.
Miles Davis leaves. Clifford Brown comes. And by the time Miles Davis gets back to New York, like about 16 months later, nobody's talking about Miles Davis. And everybody, like before then, Miles Davis was it. Like, oh, Miles Davis is going to be the next great trumpet player. And, then very sadly in 1956, Clifford Brown ends up being in this horrific traffic accident. He dies along with Richie Powell on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, right, on their way back from a gig. And it was kind of at that time, Miles Davis had just played Newport, just gotten a new record contract, and was really able to kind of put some things together. And it was almost like he relaunched his career.
Right. It was like a perfect storm.
It was like a perfect storm. It was like, literally, it was like a phoenix coming up out of the ashes.
Right.
And he was reborn, and his playing was a lot different. Everything had changed.
Yeah.
It's like a perfect storm.
That was another thing that he mentioned. He's like, if I'm not changing, then I don't want to play the same stuff. So that's where it came from.
I had a record, or I have my first solo record has been sitting on a hard drive now for a decade, almost a little less than a decade, maybe 7-8 years now.
Yeah.
And I've not, money and other things, I've not been able to do it. So during the pandemic, some things happened and I had some time and I was trying to figure out, and I wanted to do something artistic, and, I wasn't necessarily hearing any new music to kind of write it, and wasn't able to figure a whole lot out. And I was just like, so I went and listened to my record, and I was like, this isn't bad. I should let this out. And I just
couldn't do it.
I couldn't do it. I just changed so much.
Right.
I changed so much. The whole idea of going back to the studio and sitting with the engineer to mix that record was just like,
Nah, we got to do something else.
It just didn't seem like, it seemed like I would be selling a lie. Like, that was me, but it's not me now. You know what I'm saying? I don't know.
Right. Now, one thing before we wrap this thing up, because I don't care how long we go, but one thing I wanted to tell you is I had a very, very brief stint with the trombone.
Okay.
I hope you find some humor out of this. When I was, I think I picked up the saxophone originally in the 5th grade. I think that's when we were allowed to join the band in school.
Mm-hmm.
It was either 4th or 5th grade, and I started with the alto sax, and I loved it. It was. I actually have one right here that I've been staring at and meaning to go get lessons for. But I did my first year with the alto sax, had a great time with it. And my buddy Chris was the trombone player, but he was the only one. We didn't have a bunch of trombone players, just one. And the next year he moved. So this had to be in the 6th grade. He moved to a different town. So he went to a different school. So the band teacher asked, he's like, does anybody want to play the trombone? I have a trombone. You won't have to buy it. I'll just give it to you. Give it to me at the end of the year, whatever. And me being the ever ambitious child that I was like, yeah, I'll do it. Mind you, I still had the saxophone.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. So I had a big boxy saxophone case in this hand. I have this big awkward trombone case in this other hand. And I go home and I try to mess with it. And then the next day I sit down with the band teacher, just us two. And I'm like, trying to figure out, because it's completely different than any of the other.
Oh, yeah.
Other instruments. There's no buttons. There's none of that stuff. So I was like, I was there doing my thing. Then maybe a day or two later, I came in and I'm like, all right, Mr. Ritchie, there you go. I'm sticking to the alto. and that was that. And I played for 2 years. And in the pandemic, in lieu of us getting all this free money, I went and bought another one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just waiting for the right time to go ahead and get some lessons going again.
Oh, man. Yeah. You should, the gentleman that teaches here at the University of Rhode Island is a beast.
Right.
John McKenna, man, come and check out Professor McKenna. He's a beast.
Right, I'll have to. And he does like lessons and stuff like that.
He does lessons up in the Providence. He does lessons in this area and in the Barrington area, and then in Providence there's Leland Baker. And if Leland is around, he travels a lot, but he's a phenomenal tenor saxophone player. He graduated from URI with his master's degree. Plays tenor saxophone. He's also a beast. So either one of those, those guys, I would highly recommend checking out.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, all right, sir. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you. We'll do it again another time.
Absolutely.
Is there anywhere that people can reach you? You want them to hear, find out some of your music or any of that stuff? Is there anywhere?
I mean, all of my information is on the university webpage for right now. Hopefully there'll be some music coming out soon. I have a band called CBG and the Hartford Sound, which is a Latin jazz collective that I put together with some friends of mine from college, two Puerto Rican brothers that I grew up with and dragged me to a whole bunch of salsa gigs when I was in my late teens and early 20s and kind of seduced me into this music. And so we play music that is kind of a mixture of a bunch of things, straight ahead jazz, but also, heavily Latin jazz influenced, coming out of the Fort Apache and Eddie Palmieri kind of concept. So we're recording an album this summer. It'll be our first recording after being together as a band 7 years. We've been friends for over 20 years. I was working pre-pandemic with a band called the M19s.
Okay.
Which is a band that was put together by two hip-hop DJs called Stretch and Bobbito. I don't know if you're familiar with Stretch and Bobbito.
Yeah, Big L and Jay-Z, the famous freestyle from a long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, those brothers. So we had a project that we were working on, and we've done some stuff. We've done some stuff as recently as December. We did some recording. I don't know if we'll be able to get back on the road, but I was actually traveling with them right before the pandemic. Like we had been to the Kennedy Center, so hopefully I'm hoping to get back to playing with them. I'm a member of the Pittsburgh Jazz Orchestra. Of course, we lost our 2021 season because of the pandemic, but hopefully we'll be able to announce some shows coming up for this next season, 2021, 2022, and eventually I will get my solo project going again.
Well, there we go, people. That is it. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. We're going to sign off, and I'm going to talk to you guys on Monday. Peace.